This is your host, Jagriti Chandra from The Hindu. Hello and welcome to a new episode of Boarding Now, where we discuss aviation through an India lens. Today we are discussing pilot fatigue, and this is hot because in early April, just a few weeks back, Delhi High Court settled a 6-year legal dispute between pilots and the regulator, and the outcome is a slew of measures that have been mostly welcomed by pilots. There is now more weekly rest, which has gone up from 36 hours to 48 hours, and there's reduced night flying as well. The DGCA has also included a process for management of fatigue that involves regulatory oversight and a few other important decisions. To discuss this from a pilot's perspective, we have Mohan Ranganathan. He retired from SpiceJet, where he was an instructor pilot on the Boeing 737s and is also a well-regarded aviation safety expert. Welcome to the show, sir. It seems you're not very happy with the outcome of the court proceedings and the new rules.
Definitely not.
Let me lay down the context for our listeners before we discuss the issues at hand threadbare. It was back in 2019 that the aviation safety regulator, the Directorate General of Civil Aviation, brought out a new set of rules governing pilot rest and duty hours. These rules upset the pilots because it changed the provisions of the previous set of rules of 2011, such that there was reduced rest for pilots who fly ultra long haul flights. These are your flights to the US. And there was also an introduction of 2 consecutive nights of flying, which was explicitly barred in 2011 rules. There was also sweeping provision given to airlines so that they could extend the mandatory duty hours for pilots during quote-unquote unforeseen circumstances. These rules were brought out in April 2019 and led to pilot unions approaching the Delhi High Court. As part of these proceedings, a fresh set of rules were announced by the DGCA last year in January, that is January 2024, and pilots have more or less been happy, and they say that at least airlines and the regulator have conceded some ground. The regulator said that these new rules will apply from June 1, which is that the airlines were given about 6 months to implement these new rules. But the airlines strongly opposed them. It wrote to the regulator and said that the new rules that provide greater rest and reduce night flying will push up their manpower requirement, so they will need more time to hire and train more pilots. And if they did not get that time, there would be flight cancellations, which would also lead to a spike in airfares. So as a result of this opposition, the DGCA issued another order putting its rules of January 2024 on hold. And this then led to pilot unions going back to the court in April of 2024. And as a result of that, we saw earlier this year in February, the court giving its directions requiring the new norms to be implemented in 2 phases. A set of new rules would be implemented starting July 1, and then the remaining rules will come into effect from November 1. Over to you, Mohan sir. What do you think are some of the important tweaks, the important changes that the DGCA has made to the rules governing pilot rest and duty hours?
The 2 nights is a very important concession, but then it is not really a concession unless they issue clarification that it is including the window of circadian law. It should not. You should not be flying 2 nights where you infringe on that. Infringe on that is not just for flying, but the duty time, because you got to give time for pilots to unwind and recover. So what happens is, under fatigue, a pilot, even a 10-second delay in their response can result in an accident. This is something that the airline owners and DGCA should understand, and the courts in India should understand, that you can't negotiate the rest period for pilots and the time that they have. I'd like to quote one famous line from the Air France crash in Toronto in 2007, where 2005, where the chief investigator was asked whether it was a pilot error. And he said, pilots are human, and I do not judge a human why he did something which he's not trained to do. So you have to understand that the pilot in the cockpit is a human being, and there are people who run airlines, the regulator, and the ministry should understand that you can't give a time frame because your schedules are not important if you're going to have a fatal accident. As an airline, you must operate a flight only if you have fresh operating crew. If you think somebody is tired, cancel a flight. Canceling a flight, it is the airline's responsibility if you have bitten more than what you can chew. So they can't use that excuse that, if we implement something, the flights will have to be canceled. So what? Cancel the flight. It's better to be safe than sorry.
Right. So you mentioned that some concessions have been made as far as night flying is concerned. Let me explain that statement to our listeners. What the DGC has done is that it has expanded the definition of night duty. Earlier, this was midnight to 5 a.m., which has now gone up to 6 a.m. So it's been increased by an hour. Any part of a pilot's duty that falls within this window will constitute night duty. This has the impact of actually reducing night flying for pilots to an extent because they can't be assigned more than 2 consecutive night duties. Now, the maximum hours of flying duty for pilots on night duty is at 8 hours. And together with pre and post flight formalities, they can be deployed for no more than 10 hours. These are the important changes that have been made. The maximum number of landings permissible for a pilot on a night duty have also been capped at 2 landings. But sir, the point that you make about window of circadian low, can you just explain that terminology for our viewers who may not understand this easily?
What has been identified is between midnight and 6 o'clock. That is the time when your whole body, the response time, and you have what you call the rapid eye movement, REM. And that is the time where you can go into micro sleep, where you might be in the cockpit sitting, but you may be in what they call a micro sleep phenomena for 5 to 10 seconds. Several accidents have taken place. And that's one of the reasons why worldwide they have reduced the number of, like here, they've just defined it as night flying. But if you see a good airline, a good system like what they have in Singapore, the duty time is based on the time you sign on. It is not just the time that you commence your duty. If you sign on for duty and it cuts into this window of circadian low, and the number of hours of duty that you can do, the number of landings you can do, everything is restricted based on what time you sign on, you commence your duty. But here we have one size fits all, like they have it as fixed, because the duty time, even though they've made some very good points, it is more oriented towards favoring the airline management than the pilots. To have a transparent system, to take it from an aviation system which follow a very, very scientific method for night flying.
And this is why, I mean, pilots have also been left somewhat disappointed that the provision for allowing airlines to deploy them for 2 consecutive nights has not been reversed.
Yeah. One more point in this new thing. It talks of the duty period. You have to take the operating airport, how much time it takes for you to reach your home or your hotel. And they have to consider when you time your duty hours based on that, if you look at the car. But show me one airline which will follow that, because they have a fixed sign on and sign off time and the duty period commencing from A to B. But they never talk of operating to an airfield, an airport where you may take more than 2 hours to reach home, some places where you can reach in 1 hour. So when a roster is made, there is no provision for that flexibility.
You mentioned weekly rest there. Also, some concession has been made, sir. It's been raised from 36 hours to 48 hours. I mean, just explain to us why this, even though it's just a concession of 12 hours, why it's important and what is so unique about pilot rosters and schedules that this is also an important change.
See, the 2 days rest is to help you wind down. Unless otherwise, what happens is with the fatigue, you become jaded. Like, there used to be, when we were in Indian Airlines and even Air India, a lot of people encash their annual leave. The annual leave is for you to help recover, your body to recover. But a lot of people encash their leave. It's, you may get short-term finances, but you're doing a lot of harm to your system. So if you see a good system, like you go to Singapore or you go to UK, you can't encash your leave. You have to take your annual leave because they know that how important it is. So it is not just it is a ploy used by the management to, induce people to work beyond the fatigue level. Now, the car doesn't address all those. And it also doesn't address where your rest is. It has to be at home, not in a hotel. That is something that they have to clearly specify in the car.
Yeah. Okay. And so going back to the issue of, the staggered implementation, the way the implementation has been divided into 2 phases. A large chunk of rules will be implemented from July 1. The remaining, which are basically those that govern, the new definition of night flying and the relaxation that is extended to pilots. These have been postponed until November 1. Why do you think this chunk of rules governing night flying were postponed until November 1?
It's because I think more from the point of view of these long-haul pilots, it may not affect, but now even domestic flying, because we had that you can't fly 2 consecutive midnights where your duty cuts into that. And there were a lot of restrictions. Now you'll find with this, if airlines have to, like if you landed at, say, 11:30 in the night, with your sign off, your rest period starts well after midnight. So you will not be able to be rostered for a flight which cuts into anything beyond 11 o'clock in the night the next day. So it puts pressure on the roster to have the additional crew. Now, if you have that, the airlines are not employing, like you have that 40-hour contract some airlines are offering. When you submit your application for bringing in aircraft as per the CAR, you are specifying that you have qualified number of crew members, which means they can do 1,000 hours and they can do 100 hours in a month. But when you are permitting X number to just do 40 hours, but you have not employed more pilots to meet the shortfall. So what happens to the operations? Again, pressure is brought on people to fly, cut into the rest period, fly beyond the limits, underlog. So the problem starts with those contracts which the airlines offer, which DGCA is very silent about. If you say that you're bringing 100 aircrafts as per the CAR, you have to provide the number of crew to operate 100 hours a month and 1,000 hours a year. If you are giving these contracts with limited flight crew. It puts additional crew members, a lot of stress. And where the problem comes is not everyone is a high standard pilot. You have borderline pilots also, and any system will have to cater for the weakest link in the chain. Now, when you put stress on the borderline pilots, you are infringing on safety. This is something that DGCA and airlines should understand.
So one of the questions that I'm also often asked is when everything is on autopilot, why are we so focused on, whether pilots are flying for 10 hours or 12 hours? I know that I'm running the risk of dumbing things down a bit, but what is your response to a question like that?
Okay. How many times have you had a computer working 100% of the time, or your signals dropping off? Okay. Now let me give you, say you're flying from Delhi to New York. You're taking off at 45 degrees Celsius and at 1,000 feet elevation. And half an hour later, you're at 45,000 feet or 41,000 feet, with the cabin at 7,000 feet. Do people realize what is the oxygen level change at that atmosphere? As if you're going to a hill station, you do have problem, your breathing goes, and if you don't have movements, you can have a lot of problems. And how many have, and you're talking of a long flight on autopilot. And do you realize that you have to be monitoring everything? You're not just sitting there like living in a living room and watching television. You're monitoring hundreds of information which is fed into your primary flight display and navigation display. And you have to keep monitoring. And you hear things like GPS spoofing and things like that. Now, you have to be mentally alert. You may not be physically active, but you're mentally alert every single minute. And that takes a lot of people who've done, if you go to places like US where you have very high frequency, the air traffic controllers do only half an hour stint. They have a break, and again they do because of mental fatigue. You don't have that kind of a split duty in India. So to say that you're on autopilot, you're not sitting watching a television, you're watching a lot of things. And in the air, you have to be encountering a thunderstorm to understand why a relaxed pilot is essential and not somebody who is stressed.
Yeah, fair enough. And my answer to this question is always that, as a passenger, a 3-hour flight from Delhi to Bangalore is fatiguing and tiring. And you want to just get to your hotel and rest a bit. But pilots are flying for as much as 10 hours, and top of that is extra duty hours. And I don't think a lot of people appreciate that, you're doing as many as 3 or 4 landings. It's like a bus shuttle service. Not many people know about that.
Well, let me tell you about this multiple landing sector, which people don't seem to understand. There was a NASA study 25 years back or 30 years back, where they analyzed why several experienced pilots were taking decisions which were wrong, and they were getting into accidents. And one of the things that was found is during an approach to landing in adverse weather conditions, like thunderstorms or fog, your heart rate goes up to as high as 240. And when that happens, your adrenal glands are pumping very hard to compensate. Your body is depleting in sugar. And that is when the wrong decisions are taken. And that is why there was a recommendation by NTSB that you must consume fluids with sugar, to compensate for that. Now, let's compare the medical standards which worldwide we have and what we have in India. When we go for medical to CME or IAM, the amount of stress that a pilot has to undergo is unbelievable. and when you're doing a multiple sector in a day, like even domestic flights, like you do Delhi, Bombay, Delhi, couple of times, 4 landings. You're at sea level, 20 minutes later, you're at cabin altitude of 8,000. Then 1.5 hours later, you're back at sea level. During the approach, your heart rate has been pumping up and you have a lot of depletion of sugar, fatigue. Then half an hour later, you're back again, taking off, climbing to 40,000 with a cabin altitude of 7,000. Where your body is it's not constant like somebody who's driving on the road. Your body is taking a lot of things. And when you have this kind of a stress, and if you have health issues, it makes it even worse. That is something that people don't seem to understand.
Yeah, it's interesting what you mentioned about, the toll it takes on a pilot's body, the constant change in oxygen levels, etc. And not many people outside of aviation really understand this. Or I would say maybe not even outside the crew fraternity. And I also wanted to hear, share something that our listeners will find interesting. The context in which there was discussion around fatigue. This was Mangalore crash, right? So let's just bring in some history. What happened during that crash? And one of the pilots could be heard snoring inside the cockpit just minutes before the landing preparation started, and he was a little disoriented. There was sleep inertia. The landing was to happen on Mangalore's, tabletop runway, which is already a tricky runway, and there was some sort of either decision paralysis. Even though the first officer said we must go around, the pilot in command did not pay heed to all of that, and then during this time, once the report into the crash came out, there was clear mention that there needs to be a response to manage pilot fatigue. And parallelly, there was already the Naseem Zaidi committee that was constituted to look at flying duty and rest norms for pilots. And this incident influenced its report. Within months of this accident in 2010, May of 2010, the Naseem Zaidi report came out, and it paid a significant amount of attention to fatigue. And that is the big Mangalore crash is also the context in which this discussion on pilot fatigue has been happening over the past 15 years or so.
Now, talking of the Mangalore crash, I was part of the CASAC, the Civil Aviation Safety Advisory Council, which was formed after the crash. And I can tell you openly that the Mangalore crash investigation report is the most atrocious garbage report you can. They covered up a lot of things. They highlighted the pilot snoring, okay? But see where the experience came. The aircraft had captured the wrong glide slope. He recognized that and he took over. And he was diving at 4,000 feet per minute to get back onto profile. And then he suddenly leveled off to make a smooth landing. You know why? Just a few months earlier, he was pulled up and humiliated by the head of safety of Air India because they said he did a hard landing, which was well within the Boeing limit. But the company had a different limit. The court of inquiry completely ignored that. And why did he take off again after selecting? Because the runway markings were wrong. I have highlighted all this in my report. And what was 500 feet from the end of the runway marking indicated they had 2,000 feet of runway. And that is why he had tried to take off. So the fatigue was a factor that he had been taking medications. And did Air India learn anything? Did DGCA learn anything from that? No. We had the Calicut crash. The same thing, that pilot was taking medications And why was he rushing? Because he was required to operate a flight the next day. And he was trying to land when he was not even stabilized. So accountability and transparency is totally lacking. The fatigue factor was very high in Mangalore crash. It was very high in Calicut crash. And if you go through the number of accidents that we've had, you can go back as far as 1976, the Caravel crash in Bombay, when the management pilot, he operated a Boeing flight to Delhi in the morning, came back, he was in the office the whole day, and the Caravel flight to Chennai, or Madras at that time, had to be operated. The crew got into duty time, and the captain opted to operate the flight. And those days, there were no restrictions. And at one of the last recordings on CVR, and the captain says, "I'm very tired." He took the wrong switch because he mixed up the Boeing switching to the Caravel switching, and they fed fuel into the fire, and all of them on board died. So we don't learn. An accident investigation has to identify the cause and take preventive steps. You take every accident that has taken place in India during the last 25 years, you will find that we have not, every time the pilot is blamed, they will say it is a pilot error. There is no such thing as finding the fault with the system. And one of the biggest problems in India is that people don't understand, people in authority don't understand what fatigue can do. I can give you any number of accidents where fatigue or delayed decisions have resulted in a crash.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about pilot health, medical history, and fatigue, and how all of this can take a toll. This brings me to the most recent death of the Air India Express pilot, Arman, and how he collapsed from a cardiac arrest soon after operating a Srinagar-Delhi flight. The DGC has now constituted an inquiry, and without speculating about why this happened, what do you think are some of the questions or issues that the inquiry must explore? I mean, we can't. I mean, every pilot death cannot be linked to fatigue unless we have a little more details about the schedule and how much rest was being provisioned by the airline. But what are some of the questions that need to be explored following this particular tragic event?
Okay, now take your Air India Express, that recent one is not the only event. Now, I remember a few months back, there was an Indigo pilot while reporting for a flight. He had a heart attack and collapsed, right? In Nagpur, if I'm not mistaken.
Last year.
Yeah, last year. Now, if you take a few minutes back on the question of fatigue and the multiple sector flights, I mentioned about your heart rate during approach going to as high as 240. You have a pilot with a heart condition, and I read on one of the social media he's had 5 stents. Can you imagine what his heart would have been going through when he was doing 4 sectors? Because the heart has gone to 200 plus heart rate 4 times in the duty period.
In this case, it was 3 sectors. This was his third sector.
Yeah, but still, he is actually been put through the stress. And is that the only flight he's done during the week? We don't know. And what his schedule was earlier, that is also important, And same thing with that Indigo pilot. It was after 4 sectors. He has had a rest according to the airline and DGCA. They say that he has had sufficient rest. What kind of a rest? What was the schedule earlier? And the most important thing, I'm going to tell you something. If an investigator does proper investigation, they should look at the call record of his phones. Both the pilots who died with this kind of thing, you will identify the fatigue issue very simply because, the companies have printed roster. They are supposed to have a printed roster for a period. Show me one airline in India which prints out a 1-month roster and follows that strictly. And then you will find that somebody is reported sick or somebody is on duty time. And what do? The operations people from roster will call you during your rest period and say that you're required to operate the flight.
But sir, one of the things that the latest FDTL norms, the flying duty time limitation norms governing pilot rest and duty hours, talk about is fatigue reporting and management of fatigue reports, where the DGCA says that airlines will have to have a policy that not only discusses how to raise a fatigue report, but what airlines must do in response, right? And the second thing is that airlines are now required to submit a quarterly report on the fatigue reports that are filed to them, as well as the action that they have taken in response to these fatigue reports. Do you expect this to make some change that will benefit pilots?
I doubt very much because I have never seen in 25 years the DGCA taking something which is contrary to what the management wants, of an airline wants.
I love the absolute lack of faith that you have in our regulator and the system, and this lack of faith comes from years and years of following regulatory processes and being part of those discussions. It's often dismissed as cynicism, but I think this is also real life experience. I wouldn't call it cynicism. But sir, do you think these norms, are largely on par with the European regulator EASA and the American regulator FAA, the standards laid down by them?
First of all, FAA and EASA, the airlines, the pilots have a union to protect them. An airline cannot pressurize the pilot to go against what is laid down. While here, the regulator is only a facilitator, and the courts don't understand what fatigue is.
You suggested that the outer limits prescribed by the Indian regulator, as well as the European and American regulator, might be the same, but overseas there are pilot unions who have greater negotiating powers, which pilots here in our country do not have, and therefore they are able to ensure some protections are extended to them. But one important issue that I do want to discuss with you before I close this discussion is of the 40-hour contract. You mentioned this in one of your answers, but to those who are outside the aviation community, I want to get into greater detail about what you were hinting at. So 2 years back, Air India tweaked its contract and it offered pilots a guaranteed salary, which they get at 70 hours of flying, and brought it down to a salary equivalent of 40 hours of flying. Now, this pilots say will exert a lot of pressure on them. This will force them to fly more, to give up their sick leave, to compromise on their rest, because when they enter the profession, they calculate in their head their salary of, earlier industry-wide norms of 70 hours of flying. Can you explain to our listeners, sir, what are the implications from a pilot's perspective on fatigue and stress on the contract being revised to 40 hours down from 70 hours?
As far as the contract of 70 to 40 hours, if you are guaranteed 70 hours and you do not do 70 hours, if you see the way the system works, there's a lot of manipulation. People who are in the good book, you'll find some people are not flying at all. They are avoiding flying. Some do more than what is required and they pick up overtime. But what is important is where people don't understand the difference between my generation of pilots and the current generation is people are living beyond their means. If you look at the number of pilots, the peer pressure is us making them take lot of EMIs, loans. So they are up to their neck with EMIs. So when suddenly the rug is pulled under your feet, it adds to your stress. The financial stress is one of the biggest safety hazards that you have to worry about. So here again, if you had a good union, I'm not talking of any union, a good union, because I've seen many airlines are very smart. They will sort of promote substandard pilots as union leaders who will sell the colleagues. And we used to say that for every pilot who sticks to the rules, there are half a dozen pilots with the bags packed ready to fly in violation of rules. So unless the pilot's body realizes that you're a professional body, then you can enforce things, but otherwise you can't.
So thanks, sir, for sharing that with us. And I do want to take this opportunity to make a correction. We earlier mentioned that an Indigo pilot lost his life at Nagpur airport. This was not last year, but this was August of 2023. He was reporting for his duty. He was supposed to fly from Nagpur, and it was at the gate itself that he succumbed to a cardiac arrest. I hope that our listeners can appreciate the challenges under which pilots and airlines operate. We've spent a lot of time discussing issues of fatigue and the need for rest, as well as regulated duty hours. But it's also important to bring in the airline perspective. It's important to mention that airlines operate on very thin margins, that there's extreme volatility in the market. We've seen several airlines in India collapse, whether it's Go First, Jet Airways, Kingfisher before that, SpiceJet also facing a lot of financial challenges. So these are also some of the aspects that one needs to keep in mind. Moreover, there are more and more private airports that are coming up, as a result of which user charges have gone up, which means it's getting more and more difficult or more expensive for airlines to carry out their flight operations. And there are currency fluctuations. There's also geopolitics, as we are witnessing right now with the ban on Indian airlines from using Pakistan airspace. So these are also factors that need to be kept in mind. While we have looked at the pilot's side of issues, we hope to bring you also concerns facing cabin crew as well as aircraft mechanical engineers, so that we are not just focusing on a privileged lot. Thank you so much, Mohan Ranganathan, sir, and bye for now to all our listeners. Catch you later.